good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Melissa Mueller, and I am DWDC's Program Specialist. And today I am joined by my colleagues Amanda Coventry-Barrage and Kelsey Goforth. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that while we are meeting virtually, the land that Dying with Dignity Canada is on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Indigenous, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and we invite and encourage you to do your own research regarding the various treaties, in particular the land which you are meeting us on today. I am thrilled today to welcome you to another session of Focused Forum. Throughout this series, we aim to provide you with information and key takeaways, as well as create a space for conversation on end-of-life topics alongside professionals that know it best. Before I welcome today's presenter, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. Everyone on the call today is muted. However, there will be opportunities to submit questions. To do so, you can type your questions into the question bar on the Zoom side panel, and we will read it out at the end. Please try to keep your questions as concise and clear as possible. And while we are going to try to get to as many viewer questions as possible, unfortunately, we may not be able to get to everyone. So if you have any outstanding questions following the webinar, or if you have questions that are quite personal in nature, please contact us at support@dyingwithdignity.ca, and we will follow up with you individually. And we will also be sending a post-webinar survey that will pop up on your screen after the webinar, and it will give you the opportunity to share your feedback. This session is being recorded, so you will be able to watch it again later, so there's no need for you to take notes if you don't want to. And now I would love to introduce today's speaker. With us today is Dr. Jillian Tullis. Dr. Jillian Tullis is an associate professor in the Department of Communication Studies and the director of the Biomedical Ethics Program at the University of San Diego in California. Her teaching and research interests focus on health communication, specifically communication about death and dying in and outside healthcare settings. And through interviewing, participant observation, and self-reflection, her students interrogate personal, social, and political discourse about health, including food nutrition, the illness experience, and the communication in healthcare organizations. She is wrapping up a sabbatical where she is focused on the history of end-of-life care among enslaved Africans, social media and death, and interviewing people about dying well and a good death. So thank you so much, Dr. Tullis, for joining us. And I am now going to pass it over to Kelsey to get us started.
Thank you. Thanks, Melissa, for the introduction and getting us started today. And Jillian, for joining us from sunny California. Thank you for being with us this afternoon. To get us started, could you tell us a little bit about why you decided to pursue your academic research on the topic of aging adults and end of life? What inspired you to do so?
Okay, well, before I get started, I would just like to thank everyone at Dying with Dignity in Canada for inviting me. It's really an honor, and I appreciate all the labor that I haven't been able to see firsthand. So I appreciate the time. I also just wanted to acknowledge that I am currently on Kumeyaay land here in San Diego. The Kumeyaay people are one of about 26 indigenous tribes that are federally recognized in the San Diego County area. So I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that. So to answer your question more directly, I will say, I was a needy graduate student. It's really how I got started. I wish I could say that I had this altruistic light bulb moment when I was in graduate school, but I actually got started on this topic when I was in need of an assignment I needed a topic for an assignment in a graduate class. And I realized my mother and I were having some conversations about dying and death that were really different than what I remember from when I was a child, when I had experienced dying in my own family. And so that sent me to the literature. And I started realizing that there weren't very many studies, research, scholarship from the perspective of communication studies, which is interested in messages and how those messages, shape our reality, create our sense of understanding about the world. And so I pretty much from that point forward, I thought, well, this is a really interesting topic. It was personally interesting to me. And I found that it did what, good academic projects should do, which was to try to fill a gap. And I think what I realized, and thinking about this over the years, I realized that people were interested in the topic. They just didn't have a kind of a conduit for where to start, who to have these conversations with. And I found that as a result of my interest, my colleagues were, wanting to talk to me about it. They were doing things like reaching out to me. And I think that kind of solidified then the kind of maybe the more altruistic side, which is what I think is the ultimate outcome, which is that I could be a facilitator for these discussions, these really important discussions.
Great. Thank you for that background. One of the things that you talk about in your work is a good death and what a good death is. So to you, how would you define a good death?
Okay, this is a tricky one for me because if you had asked me this probably 20 years ago or so, I would have said, oh, well, it is a death that is free of pain. It is free of spiritual pain or existential pain, it's free, I should say, of physical pain. I think that was me embracing what I had access to, which was a hospice model of a good death. And I think that I will, fully embrace it. I thought that made sense to me. I thought that also what was important for a good death was that somebody not be alone, at least as much as you can be accompanied by someone. I thought that was an important idea. I think over the years, the more experience that I've had, the more, and that's experience both personally, professionally. I think my definition has expanded quite a bit because for every person that thinks that dying at home is good, there are probably an equal number of people that feel as though dying in a hospital is a more appropriate or comfortable space. And just as there are people who believe in medical aid in dying and want that as an option, there are people who think that would not be a good death. So so on one hand, I feel like I still have my original core belief about this, but I think that it has certainly expanded over the years to incorporate something that is more broad and inclusive and expansive.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's so important to touch on, that there is no one good death. A good death can be different depending on the person and their values and beliefs and what they've experienced in their life and how they want their life reflected in those final moments, whether that's hours, days, weeks, leading up to it or longer. So it's very, very great that you brought that up. So regardless of a good death that can be different from person to person, regardless of what that looks like, what types of structural barriers do you think are in place that prevent people from either knowing what a good death is to them and then achieving that good death?
Well, I approach a question like this by trying to look at the challenges at a couple of different levels. So on one level, I think the first level being at the kind of individual level. I think that people as individuals are quite surprised how much we actually know about the dying process, about things like prognosis. And they're shocked by that. I think there's a great mystery. So I think education at that kind of individual level is one, you could argue, is one structural issue. I think at the next level up, you have family or community challenges and structures that may be in place. So, while we may die alone by, as an individual person and in somewhat, and people, we can't take somebody with us, so to speak. I think that we also have challenges at the kind of family or community level. So we may have expectations from our loved ones, from our community about how we should die and what that experience should be like, that are also create a little bit of a structural challenge, I would say. So attitudes, cultural values, religious values may be part of that. At the next level, I would say that we're talking about organizational or institutional challenges. And that might be, if you're getting treatment at a cancer center or if you're getting treatment in a hospital, those spaces may not create time and space for conversations about dying that would help people be better prepared. Physicians themselves, healthcare organizations that are made up of people also have individual values and beliefs that come to bear on the interactions that they have with their patients and patients' family members. And then I think about policies and kind of social challenges, discourse that maybe is happening at a kind of structure, like this high level, right? So what's happening in our larger communities? What are governments doing that might be creating particular structures and challenges that make it difficult for people to access good end-of-life care? So, for example, I'll just take the United States as one example. We don't have particularly great access to medical care. We don't have a universal kind of healthcare system. And that means that individuals, there's discrepancies between who has access and who doesn't. And that may be one of those types of structural barriers that keep people from being able to access not just information, but then also the actual care that goes along with great quality end of life care. We can see, I can think of other examples when we have tried to make improvements on our healthcare here in the US, where there were talk about death panels, that may cause fear amongst people about what end of life care actually looks like. And the real purpose was to give physicians reimbursement so that they could have conversations with their patients. It wasn't to make decisions about whether or not somebody lived or died. But that kind of, that moment was blocked, right, by people who had alternative, ulterior motives, right? So there are particular structural challenges that also happen at that kind of social, larger discourse that are in communities and linked to government policies and so on. So those are just a few examples. I can certainly elaborate, but those are a few that come right to mind.
Thank you. I think those are great examples, and I like how you address the different levels where those barriers may come into effect. So given these barriers and, given the space in which we're operating and trying to plan as best we can, do you have any tips, anything that's come out of your research for how individuals should approach planning for their own deaths, considering what they might want for their good death?
Yes. So I try to tell people to talk about this topic early and often. Talk about it when you don't need it. That's my first recommendation to most people is don't wait until there's a crisis. Don't wait until you're sick. Don't wait to have these discussions. It is I call it the gift of information, because what happens when you are thrown into a medical crisis or you get a serious diagnosis or prognosis is that you have to dedicate your emotional, mental energies to what is happening right in front of you. And I argue that it is much better to start those conversations early and have them when it's not critical. So I joke with my students, like we just had Thanksgiving here last week. I say, you're going to go home, you're going to see your family. Why not start the conversation while people are, eating mashed potatoes and gravy? And because then people can approach it maybe with less emotion. You need to sometimes have a little bit of rational, practical approaches. And so I encourage it to happen early and often. And I also try to remind people that if you don't want to have those conversations, you will then be at the mercy of maybe a healthcare institution, or you're at the mercy of relatives who perhaps you don't trust or have different values from your own. So by not engaging in the conversation, you are making a type of choice, and that is to just defer to what may be the most care, what maybe is the highest level of care, and maybe that is not consistent with your values. If you're willing to take that risk, then I think by all means, but I say have the conversation early. And have multiple conversations, I should add. It doesn't have to be just one. So I can remember, 20 years ago talking to my mother about her wishes and her volunteering this information to me. and then having a discussion with her about it maybe 10 years later, and she says, I wanted that. When did I say I wanted that? So, we can have those conversations over time and update them and change them as we change. It doesn't have to be set in stone either.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I think, what a lot of what you're saying, those open conversations, and also coming to the realization that everybody is dying, everyone will die, whether you're students in their 20s and 30s or retired people or anybody, we're all heading in the same direction, and coming to terms with that reality is one part, and having those open discussions is another. And I feel like both of those kind of come into the death positive movement in a lot of ways. So I'm wondering if you could share a little bit more about the death positive movement and what some of the main objectives are of that movement.
Well, the death positive movement, as I understand it, is the primary goal for people that are associated is to just accept that death is not a taboo topic. It is not morbid to want to talk about death. So very much in line with my own, I wish it had existed when I had first started doing this work, but very much something that I have worked. I think I have strided to make a reality, which is that it's not taboo, that people don't see Jillian coming and think, oh my gosh, here we go, with the death talk, but that it's not unusual. And I think that's their primary goal. And what that looks like can be a range of things for people. Some people want to do things like have quiet contemplation and read books, and other people want to be out in the community attending something like a death cafe. And I think all of those things are would be consistent with that movement.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And one thing that has also come up in one of the talks you did is the idea that death is a part of life, not the end of life. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I think it is both, right? I think that obviously there are people who believe that there is life after this life, and but I think that when I say that, when I hear myself saying that out loud, what I want to convey to people is that it is part of this journey that we are on, right? So we are born and it will end in our death. At least as of right now, we don't know of anyone who's been able to live forever. And so I want my students, I want people who I interact with, who who are attending this webinar, to be able to accept it as part of this progression of living beings, living things die. And that's really how I view it, not necessarily something that is disconnected. And I maybe it seems obvious that, of course, death is a natural part of life, but I think for some people there is a rather intense pursuit of maybe very long life or no end to this life. It's super philosophical, I suppose.
Thank you for that. So the next question is about educating ourselves on death and grief-related topics, and just tying into literacy in those areas. And you mentioned telling your students, it's Thanksgiving, go home and have those conversations. Is your sense there that it's most important for them to have conversations with their, older loved ones who might be, advancing in age and dying, more quickly than they are? Or do you see this as an opportunity for everybody, sort of regardless of age, to think about and talk about what they might want?
Yeah, I think this is a great question. And in fact, I asked my students to give, my end-of-life communication students to give some input on this. So I said, well, what age do you think this conversation should start? And many people said 5. I don't know, 5 years old. They said, and they thought that ultimately these conversations should be happening early. They should be happening over the course of a lifespan, really. And I would add that, it happens, it shouldn't be, they didn't recommend like you walk up to a 5-year-old and you tell them, well, guess what, you're gonna die. They didn't recommend that kind of approach. What they thought was that it should be context specific. So, if it's a pet that dies, if it's a grandparent that dies, that they're able to have these types of conversations early that are age appropriate, that match the developmental age of a child, and that they happen over the course of a person's life. So another time that I think it's really important to have a very focused conversation is when somebody learns how to drive. I mean, you learn how to drive, you are operating a dangerous automobile, what can be a dangerous automobile. If a young person is in an accident, there may be questions about whether or not organ donation is appropriate, how long, if at all, somebody may want to have their life sustained through medical technology. And I think there are other moments when people again want to have another conversation. It might be when you are partnered with somebody, when you have children, so that you have some sense about, again, if your values have changed, if you have different ideas about how you would like to approach, assuming that you have some control, these are moments to take advantage of those points, turning points in life.
Absolutely. We try to recommend similar to that, those big moments in life and when things change, both in your personal life or with your health, and reevaluating things at those specific moments. And also, with this discussion of advanced care planning, if the person who you had assigned to be your substitute decision maker, something happens and you don't want that person anymore, or that person isn't in your life anymore, you're going to want to update your paperwork as well. Yeah. So, looking at those sort of triggers along the way that might lead to some rethinking and replanning.
Yes.
So in your research, in your work, and teaching as well, have you noticed anything just compared to the past few decades? Are there any improvements that you've seen in the area of deaf literacy in North America? Are we getting better at having these discussions, or not really? Any observations there?
Yeah, this is something I think a lot about, because I wonder, certainly have moments when I think, my gosh, I have been studying this for nearly half of my life, and it feels like not a lot has changed. I can still pick up Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's book, which is, I think written in 1968 or 1969, and I still see many of the issues that she was raising, decades and decades ago. But then I have to say, okay, don't be so cynical. There have been changes. I am not one. I used to feel like I was the only person that was studying this topic, and I think there are lots of little moments, little examples of, I think, what might signal to some incremental changes. So I think about things like the death positive movement, Death Salon, Death Cafe was, cropped up around the same time. I think about the number of people who are interested in doing death doula training, and that as another moment that, would suggest that there have been changes, that people are embracing this. I think about some of the green burial changes that we have seen, that this is another mechanism to have conversations about. It's beyond the scope of some of my work. I'm more interested when people are dying, but I think that's a sign still that people are embracing those options. They want the options. The number of people who tell me they want to be turned into a tree has grown significantly. And I also think that we're seeing, and certainly in the United States, and I know it's happening in Canada as well, that we are seeing medical aid in dying. We have more states in the U.S. that are making this an option for folks as well. So I think all of these things, when I start putting them together, do feel like there are some shifts that are happening. I would like to hear more. I would like to see if there's more data that suggests that people are filling out their advanced care plans. But we recently hear maybe 2 or 3 years ago now, we learned that we're seeing more people that are dying at home as opposed to in hospital. That had, was the first time in at least a couple of decades. So I think that there are those signs that make me feel like, okay, maybe that we're seeing some positive changes in kind of improving the conversation or the ability to have the conversation.
Great, thank you.
Mhm.
So we'll shift gears a little bit now and talk a bit more about communication at end of life, and mainly bringing in sort of the clinician side of things and how they're managing those conversations. So what would you say is the current communication style that many clinicians use with patients who are approaching end of life?
So, because of COVID, I haven't had as much, like I would say, recent clinical experience. But I can, but I'm going to go on a limb and say that probably the experience I do have is likely to still stand and be true. I think in many clinical spaces, there is a lot of hesitancy to have honest, forthright conversations around end of life. So I think one of the reasons, for example, that we're seeing an increase in the number of doulas and people that are interested in doing end of life kind of doula work is that people are discovering that maybe even in hospice settings, people aren't getting as much education around end of life processes as they should be. I think the fact that even hospice utilization hasn't jumped quite a lot over the last few years may signal that people still aren't getting as much information about their prognoses when they are dying. So I think what happens a lot of times, and I can certainly say a colleague of mine and I wrote about this as it related to terminally ill head and neck cancer patients, is that what we found was that clinicians kind of took a hands-off approach. Unless the patient was going to ask, they were not going to offer information, and or at least as much information as we would have liked. We saw this in like our ability to recruit people. We saw this even once we did successfully recruit people for the study, that sometimes a patient would say, like, just because I can't be cured doesn't mean I'm dying. And so those moments kind of suggest that maybe the conversations aren't quite as forthright as some of us would like them to be. That perhaps it's also still a challenge to have some of these conversations to get things documented well before illness. So, for example, I can go to my doctor and request that I have an advanced care plan put into my file, but there's certainly been times when I might fill out the checklist before I'm seeing the doctor, but then whether or not that conversation actually happens once I'm in the kind of clinical space and being seen by the physician is another question. So I still think there's some hesitancy. Again, there have been a few little moments that I have seen that suggest, okay, obviously it's not every physician. There are some great examples of physicians, particularly a couple here in California that have been featured in documentaries that are clearly having these conversations with their patients. But I think that there's still some hesitancy on the part of physicians to like deprive patients of hope or deprive families of hope, when really what I think most people want is they want to have the information, and then they can in turn make decisions, even if those decisions are difficult. I hope that answers your question. I feel like maybe I took a route getting there.
No, absolutely. I think that's very clear. And I mean, what came to mind for me when you were talking and how you mentioned that clinicians aren't necessarily coming forward with the information unless directly asked. It seems to really impact the whole informed consent conversation, right? You can't really ask for further details on something if you don't know that thing's an option, or you felt that it didn't apply in your situation. So in your work, have you observed any shortfalls involved with this specific strategy when it comes to conversation? Has there been any research on how the patients are impacted by that? Or
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting. So, okay, I have one way that I would answer this is to say that part of the challenge is that also patients don't know what they don't know. So I think this may sound odd to put it that way, but I think on one hand, if if a patient is receiving any type of information from their physician, they might assume that that is all that they need to know. And I think, so on one hand, so in this particular study that I was mentioning with my colleague, Lori Roscoe, what we found was that patients weren't unsatisfied with the communication with their physician. But when you can step outside of the interaction, and as we were trying to do, look at these things as they're happening kind of simultaneously, is what we realize is that, okay, physician's not volunteering information, patient is not asking, they don't know to ask, and so the physician thinks that they have managed the encounter well, or that they have done their due diligence because, well, I gave the patient a chance to ask and they didn't have any questions, right? And so I think I think on one hand I would say, oh well, clearly, patients should feel as if their needs aren't being met, but I don't know that they're aware that their needs are not being met, if that makes sense. So are there shortfalls or shortcomings? I think yes, but I think how much people understand that, how much the dying person or their family members understand that is a little bit harder to assess. It may not be until after the fact, if they even have an opportunity for that conversation or some type of debrief, that they go, oh, wait a minute, like I wish the doctor had told me that, or I wish somebody had said that. Yes, I think that kind of thing does happen. And some people are frustrated. I would just add that in doing interviews during my sabbatical, which sadly ended in August, when I was doing interviews with people about a good death and dying well, what many people used as their jumping off point and to inform their decisions were negative experiences that they had. So I know that those, in that sense, I know that there are challenges and that people's wishes and needs are not being fulfilled in those clinical encounters because they're playing out as people make decisions for themselves into the future. Almost everyone had a story about someone who they felt needed more information and didn't get it. And that was informing their current desires, wishes, and choices to communicate their wants and desires in the present.
Thank you. And what do you think the solution or solutions might be to this and the communication gaps? Do you think it's clinician-driven, patient-family-driven, a combination of both? Is there anything organizations like ours can be doing more of to make people sort of aware of what they can do in the healthcare space as patients and families? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely kind of a mutual challenge. I think there's a scholar, and forgive me to this person, the last name is Thay, I believe, T-H-E, and they talk about this kind of dance that happens. And I think in that sense, we're talking about two parties that are in this exchange together. I will say that the majority of the power, however, lies with the physician. They have the most knowledge, they have the most experience. So on one hand, I feel like the responsibility rests more heavily with the physician. But I do know that if patients and families are doing more direct advocacy, they're more likely to get the information that they want or that they need. With that in mind, when I am talking to students, when my friends call me and they ask for advice or they're confronting, particular issue, I try to better prepare them by giving them some ideas about the types of questions they may want to ask. So I feel like if I can help raise the level of conversation at the patient family level, then that can have a particular type of impact, positive impact, because I do think ultimately we are in a Western kind of medical perspective where patients are supposed to have a certain amount of autonomy and authority. And so in that sense, I think the questions, if they are coming from the patient, are a little bit more likely to then be addressed, but they have to have that knowledge. So both people can do better. I think both sides can do better. I think we can educate physicians far better. I wish physicians, across the board had to have communication courses that were, that occurred throughout their education. that they got, had a palliative care rotation, that was standard. So I think there are things that can change on the kind of structural institutional levels that could also make improvements as well.
Thank you. Are there movements in the States right now to try to change the curriculum in medical schools, or like you said, have mandatory palliative care rotations, or has that been sort of a big part of the discussion in the United States?
I would not say a big part of the discussion. I think that what I have seen is that it has, I think, again, it's happening like in more fragmented ways. So it may happen. Like when I was in my doctoral program, we did some communication training because it eventually became part of the certification process for physicians. So in medical school, we were trying to do some communication training so that they could be prepared to pass their certifications. But I think you'll see it probably more medical school to medical school as opposed to something that is happening across the board, unfortunately. Yeah.
Thanks for that. So you mentioned some of the past research studies that you've worked on and your observations from those. Are there any current or ongoing research studies that either you or your colleagues are working on that you'd like to highlight for us? Any new findings that have been interesting in the end of life space?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm trying to think. I think that one of the things that I feel most maybe excited by is that I do see more students, more scholars that are trying to expand the populations that are being investigated. So, for example, there's radical death studies that is here in the US. There's queer death studies that I think is, I want to say it's not the UK, but I think it's in Europe. So that there are folks that are trying to do more work to think about marginalized communities and, historically minoritized communities or communities that have lots of disparities around health disparities and end of life kind of outcomes. And so I think that I don't know that I could point to a single particular project, but I feel like there are more initiatives kind of happening broadly to kind of expand some of that work so that we are going to, I think, because one of the things that I have frequently questioned is if some of the good death kinds of perspectives and movements have really centered white, middle-class, educated people, straight people, as opposed to thinking about what does it mean for communities of color, what does it mean for indigenous communities, for LGBTQ communities, what does their version of dying well look like? What do people with disabilities have to say? So I am feeling great about the ways in which these conversations seem to be happening in lots of these spaces where people are starting to ask this question, like, I always say, who is a good death for, right? Who's invited to, be participating and informing these definitions? And I feel like more folks are starting to pop up who are trying to do some of that work.
That's great. Yeah, we had a researcher on last week, I think, as well, based in Canada, but she was also able to share some of what you're alluding to as well, trying to hear from different individuals, and shared a little bit about what the landscape is in end-of-life research in Canada as well. So very interesting, and I think all of us are looking forward to what's coming out in that space over the next several years. So we're going to open it up to audience questions. Thank you so much so far, Jillian, for all the amazing information. And it's been great to hear your perspectives and to hear what you've been working on. So to get us started for the audience section, I was wondering if you could share a little bit more about what the hospice model of a good death means. You talked about that early on, but just in case folks on the call aren't aware of what that means, any information would be great.
Yeah, so in hospice, first, I think I always want to remind people that it's really a philosophy first and foremost, and that as a result of the philosophy, there's certain types of care that should follow. But the philosophy first is that death is a natural end to life, and that we should do little to interfere with that process, but that we can do a lot to help people manage symptoms, help people control pain. And that pain, again, is both a physical pain and it may be like a psychic or emotional or existential pain. So what ultimately that means is that the care, you're going to get care from a series of perspectives, or not clinical perspectives, but disciplinary perspectives. So you'll have someone and the care is delivered by a team. And I think that's another thing to keep in mind. So that particular version of a good death means that you're having all of these dimensions of your life that are being attended to in order to manage, hopefully control, if possible, eliminate pain. So if you're having emotional or existential pain, you will have access to someone who does spiritual care. You will have access to someone who may be able to help you with cognitive, psychological issues. So you may have a counselor, therapist on the team. And ultimately, then the death is a natural death that is, again, designed to control the pain. And that would count as a good death if someone's last moments have all of those things kind of under control.
Thank you. That's helpful. So we talked also a little bit about what you've been observing, and I think what a lot of us in space have seen more questions about things like green burials and the death doula movement and home funerals and things like that. Do you see, I think it's probably hard to predict, but do you see things looking very different 100 years from now? Do you see sort of us going back in time to when most people died at home, had home funerals, everybody was used to, washing the bodies of their loved ones, things like that? Do you think it's going to be a significant shift, or do you think the more medicalized model will be still the most prevalent?
Wow, it's a very good question, because as you're asking the question, I'm thinking about what are the medical technologies that have yet to be discovered, right? I mean, I just was listening to our local public radio station, and they were talking about how they're sending, I think, stem cells into space to understand how the cells age. And one of the hopeful outcomes for those researchers is if they can figure out why the cells age in particular ways in space, that then they can maybe understand how we age here on Earth, and then slow that process, right? Slow the aging process. So on one hand, I think, yes, people are discovering again that there are these kinds of green burials, home funerals, like that family members can be very involved in the dying process and the after death process of their loved ones. And on one hand, that feels like a return to the past and a return to something that people might think is great, is a better version, a less medicalized dying. And then I think on the other hand, like I sometimes see, the role of artificial intelligence and how people might approach their grieving experience. And then I think about medical technology and our efforts and I'm not opposed to curing cancer by any stretch, for example, but I also think there will be consequences of those types of evolution. So, which may thrust more people into in a medicalized kind of space. So on one hand, I think, we're going back, and we're gonna return to a more, I don't know what the great adjective is, a calmer, less medicalized dying. And then on the other hand, I think, well, maybe not, maybe we're going to have new inventions, new technology that's going to have us in, extending life. But my concern, I guess, ultimately is, while life expectancy has extended for some people, it hasn't for all people. And so I think it's Ezekiel Emanuel has written about, like, let's get everybody to 75, right? Let's make that a goal. Let's make it so that everyone that's born at least gets to this kind of minimum threshold. So yeah, I don't know.
No, thank you. Those were all, great points and really interesting too, what you shared about the stem cells and all of these things being explored. I mean,
Yeah.
that's a lot to to think about. Thank you for that. So we have more questions, but before I get into those, we have a couple lovely comments that came through that I wanted to share. So we have somebody who's tuning in and they're a death doula, and they just want to thank you so much for all that you do in the space. And somebody else thanking you for this highly valuable information. So lots of people are really benefiting from everything you're sharing today.
Thank you.
So you also mentioned early on that people don't realize how much knowledge we do have about the death process and prognosis. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. I think that now this is, I think, perhaps more true for certain types of diseases, but cancer is one of them, where we tend to know quite a lot about the kind of the evolution of a particular illness or this particular illness or disease. And while you can't predict necessarily within like hours or days, how someone's illness will progress, I think there are moments during the course of that disease course where there is a sense about what is happening with the body. And I think then once you get into more active dying, there are physical signs and symptoms. The body, just like at the time of birth, the dying body knows what to do. It has its own kind of knowledge and logic, and that's how I describe it to my students. And there's a great little booklet by, I believe, Barbara Carnes is the name, and it's called Gone From My Sight. And it's a teeny tiny little booklet. A lot of hospices here give them to patients and families, and she has laid out, she was a nurse, has laid out this kind of stages of dying as people get closer, what kinds of signs and symptoms to look for. And so I try, if people are open and they have approached me about, like, I had a colleague, for example, when her father was dying, I said, I know this is hard to read. I said, especially because you're at the bedside with your father, but I said, if you have a moment and you're willing to take a look at it, I said, it could be valuable to you and your sisters and her father's wife. I said, because you'll be able to tell, for example, when there's like mottling in the legs, or when extremities start getting cold, or if somebody's breathing changes. And so she was able to actually be present and call her siblings into the room because she noticed these like kind of little subtle changes that were happening before her father, before he died. And so I think that there are many, and that happens not just in the dying process, but even at the, once somebody has died, there's a big movement around things like embalming, right? This is something that, embalming a body, but it's not required. And I think people this is where I think you used the word earlier about literacy. I mean, I think this is where if we could become more death literate, then we would be better equipped to then, if we want to be present, if we want to be able to support each other better. And we don't have to be, it doesn't have to be it's obviously very mysterious. It's the most mysterious thing that we will probably experience. And it's the most profound thing we will probably experience in our lives. But if we have little bit of information, it sometimes can make a tremendous difference.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you. And thank you for sharing your story of your friend as well, and how you were able to support her, and that clearly had a big impact on those final moments for that family. So I think that's so important for them. So you mentioned about your mom and how 10 years ago I can't believe I said that, I would never want that, and her perspective on whatever that end of life piece has changed pretty drastically, it seems. Do you, in your research, have you found any takeaways about how our feelings, perspectives about death change as we age? Like how, are there any, does it depend from person to person, depending on other factors in their life, or is there any sort of consistency with how we consider those topics?
Yeah, I think, it's interesting. I think, I think it's definitely person to person. I don't know, I can think of, my mom has always been pretty open over the years. I think, she had some deaths in her own family. And then, of course, once I started studying this, like, she's my greatest sounding board for all of my ideas and reads all my stuff, so she's thinking about it probably almost as much as I am at any given day. But I think about, they used to say in all the hospice trainings I've ever taken or participated in, they always say, people tend to die the way that they lived. And so I don't, as soon as I say it, somebody will have an example that will counter me. So, but I think generally speaking, people don't get too very close to the end of their lives and have like a drastic change. But that doesn't mean that people can't have some other experiences that lead up that actually do end in some type of great difference. I think sometimes people might say to themselves, okay, I thought I wanted this, but then I watched somebody else have this similar experience, and now I've changed my mind about this. So I think that there are we can have these turning point moments or critical moments in our lived experience that will change people. But I haven't, I have students sometimes that take my classes because they say, well, I'm very afraid of this topic, and I'm hoping that by the end, like, I might feel more comfortable. And some like budge like this much, they budge a little teeny tiny bit. They have a little bit more comfort, but they're still like really mortified or terrified by the idea of dying. So I don't know that I have seen much, and I don't think that I've seen much in the way of research that says people have very drastic changes, towards the end. I can give one example. I have a memory of my paternal grandfather at a family reunion. Now, he was a Baptist preacher for like 25 years. He was a man of faith. And he said to a family member, I'm not afraid of dying because I know where I'm going. And I remember this as a child, like overhearing this conversation, thinking, oh, that's pretty impressive, And when he got to the end of his life, I didn't see somebody, at least as I heard the stories about the end of his life, I didn't see somebody who was embracing the afterlife. I saw somebody who was still very much tied and tethered to this place, this life. And I'm not saying that's wrong. I think that, there's something interesting about that, is that ultimately when he was really confronted by it, he still wanted one more day. One of my uncles says he wanted to stay with my grandmother for as long as he could. And so while he wasn't afraid of it, he wasn't also trying to necessarily hasten that process for himself, right? So I think there's something like, perhaps he was like, I'm going to just ride this out for as long as I can, and I didn't see the barriers like come down as maybe in the way that I had expected.
Thanks. It's so interesting how I'm sure a lot of people on the call can relate to some of those early memories that we have of seeing our loved ones die, or pets, or whoever, and what we're thinking and what our observations are going through that process. And that also ties into something you talked about earlier on about your students saying, I think 5 is a good age to start talking about death and dying, and keeping it appropriate for the age, of course, and something that can be absorbed by the child at that age. Are there any resources that you've seen that seem quite helpful when it comes to raising death and dying with children?
Yeah, there's some great, one of the things that I have my students take a look at are children's books. There are, I think what I like about children's books is that there's a range of, if you're from a religious family and you want to have your child exposed to a religious idea about dying and death, you can find that. If you are someone who is a religious, you want something that is just like the facts, you can find also books that will help you work through that with your child, work through like, what does this mean with your child? And so I often recommend children's books. You can look at a bunch of them and then make a choice about which is most consistent with your values and beliefs. And I think, so that's one. I think another thing that I sometimes, there have been, and NPR, National Public Radio here in the U.S., did a series called Life Kits, and they have some resources that are there about how to talk to children about dying. Unfortunately, in the United States, we have had far too many school shootings. So children are, I think, being exposed to this topic more than maybe sometimes people realize. And I think similar to issues around sex and sex education is that we sometimes wait too long to start the conversation. And so I see a kind of parallel approach, which is that, you can talk about these things in small incremental ways, and you can put it in the context of a plant dying, for example, right? It can be something even that we may be less emotionally attached to say like, no, living things die, right? And that is something that people can generally grasp, even little kids can grasp, and that you can take it from there. Just like you would teach a kid about if you're trying to do sex education over a lifespan, you teach the child the correct terms for body parts so that they are able to, and then you build on that. So I think I say to parents, if this is a conversation you want to talk about, you don't have to give the child everything. You can simply answer their questions and then provide a little bit of information. A lot of times kids will say, okay, thanks, and then walk away. And then, it won't be until later that the conversation comes up again. There are lots of, there are just, I think, lots of texts, for lack of a better term, if it's TV shows and, Disney characters die, the film Coco is one of those, films that also, might be a mechanism that can sometimes help kids also begin that kind of process. So does that answer your question?
No, absolutely. And I think too, people sort of underestimate how curious kids can be too, right? And they are asking questions, and they do, okay, grandma died. I do want to hold her hand now, and that's okay. It's, there's, I think that curiosity is often a good thing, and something to consider as well.
Yeah.
So I think we have time for, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to add one other thing. I think it's important, and parents, I'm sure parents know this, but you're also modeling for them. So you're teaching your children, even if you don't have a book, you don't give them any resources, they're watching you, they're watching the adults. And so I think this is where I also want to make a case for normalizing the feelings that come along with dying, and that there's a conversation that goes along with explaining why we're crying because grandma died, right? Because we're sad about it. And I think sometimes, parents push the children away, they put them in another room, but they sense what's going on. And that's something that we pick up on as children, that we take with us into the future. So I just wanted to add that one element too.
Absolutely. No, that's really important. Thank you. So I think we have time for a couple more questions before we wrap up. So this one, somebody is asking, again, referencing back to any research studies that you've done, have you ever come across any patients with family members that struggle to let go? So from this question, I'm getting the sense that maybe the person is feeling ready to die, and the dialogue is more, you're okay, we can, just stick around a little bit longer. How does that impact end of life, and has there been any research on that?
Yes. Yes. So I have seen this happen in a couple of different settings. I've seen this happen in, I was doing observations in a oncology clinic, and I saw it in that particular context. I've seen it at, during hospice visits. So I've seen it happen in a range of settings. I've seen it happen in kind of acute care settings as well, hospital settings. So I think that I think that most people would say that that our sense when a patient, when a dying person is ready to die, that they sometimes can feel or sense that there are family members that are holding on. It's why in hospice and other end of life settings, you'll sometimes see, sometimes a nurse will come along, a chaplain will come along and encourage family members to tell the dying person that it is okay for them to die, and in some ways give permission, because the argument is that dying people, one of the last senses to go is their hearing, so they are very much able to experience what's happening in the room. Excuse me. And so I think there are definitely instances when people will. I mean, I've seen instances where people will continue pursuing treatment that they don't want, that they're tired of. I just was telling this story yesterday to my health communication students about a man that came to the oncology clinic where I was doing observations. I was shadowing the oncologist, and the oncologist says, how are you doing? And the man, he's there with his wife and his adult daughter, and he says, I'm tired of coming here. I'm tired of all the tests, and I'm tired of all these procedures. And the clinician said, well, you can go to hospice, like as if it was this awful consolation. And the daughter says, well, did you hear that, Dad? You can just go to hospice then and die. And I was like, oh my goodness, perhaps this is not at all what this man is trying to convey. We say in communication, there's the message, right? The actual words that are being spoken. And then there's that's the content level of the message. And then there's the relational level of the message. And that's often the meaning of the message. It's saying something about my relationship to, in this case, the cancer center or the oncologist or my family. And this man, in my mind, was saying, I am just tired. I want to spend my time doing other things. And it didn't mean that he was going to even be dead in 6 months or less. It was just like, maybe he just needed a break. Maybe he needed to take a month to go fishing or to spend time with his grandchildren and not have to come to the cancer center and be poked and prodded and analyzed, and just be in this physical space that reminds him of his illness. So I think there are ways in which we do a disservice to people by not allowing them. And I've seen people hushed. Oh, shh, don't say that. You're not dying. You're going to be fine. It's like, well, this person is maybe saying to us in this space that they're desperate to have this conversation. They want to have this conversation, and everybody is doing everything to shut it down. And so I think, and unfortunately, this happens sometimes in hospice, even in hospice settings where death is supposed to be normalized and accepted. And so I always, if I'm in a research position, I try, if I can, to say something to the clinicians, whatever member of the team is that I'm working with, to suggest maybe there's something else happening here. When I am there, I hope if I'm the volunteer, that I'm embracing these conversations, allowing people to tell me what they want to talk about. But I have definitely seen it happen where people then prolong. They say, well, my family, they know that their family is relying on them, right? Or has some type of expectation, and they're trying to the end, appease the family. It's very difficult.
Yeah, it sounds like it is. And I think some of this also ties into the conversation about hope, and how sometimes there's real emphasis on hope, and maybe there needs to be a little bit of a reframing about what that hope is. Maybe the hope is that the remaining time is full of family and friends and music and whatever the person values. It's not necessarily hope that this reality is going to go away necessarily. So
yeah, absolutely. And we know, let's face it, some of the treatments that people will put themselves through can be grueling. So I think this is where I hope that patients, that family members are asking, like, well, what does it look like? And that physicians are sharing that information. What does it look like if we do chemotherapy, another round of chemotherapy? What is my day-to-day experience like if I do more dialysis? For example, if I'm just going to spend 8 hours getting dialysis, maybe that's not how I want to spend my time. But if it is, then yes, let's do that. But I think it's important, right, to think about what, again, the reframing is critical. Yeah.
Sure. So I think we'll do one more question. Before we do, though, I just wanted to flag for the audience that Amanda put a link in the chat to a webinar that we're hosting tomorrow at the same time, 3 o'clock Eastern, 12 Pacific. So there's still room if anybody wants to register and join us again tomorrow afternoon. So the last question is coming from somebody who's reflecting on the current over 75-year-old demographic, and their observation here is that some of the folks that they're talking to, I don't know if it's their own family or maybe in a clinical setting, but they seem more private and reluctant to have some of the dialogues about end of life. So do you have any tips for engaging with that population specifically who might be advancing in age?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Oh gosh, this is a tricky one because I think what happens is a lot of times it feels like, and it may be received as a type of being impolite, right? I think we have a politeness, in some ways, I think we have a politeness problem around this issue, is that we think it's impolite to raise concerns or questions about what somebody might want. I often try to encourage people, especially if this is your family member, like to say, this would be helpful to me. I know that you don't want to talk about this, or you maybe are reluctant to talk about it, especially if you feel like you've tried and you keep getting shut down. But to lean somewhat heavily on this idea that it would be helpful for you to know what, so I would say if this were my mother, not my mother, let's say my father, he's a little bit more reluctant. My father, if I'm saying to him, like, I would say to him, Dad, it would be very helpful for me to know where you stand, so that if the doctor asks me, or if your siblings ask me what you want, that I can be informed, right? And then my other tip a lot of times is, don't keep pressing it. Like, so you have that one moment, let the person answer you and you say, okay, thank you. And then you come back to it again. Because I think sometimes we think that we need to have everything hashed out, and it really might be too much for someone emotionally to be contemplating, right? I think so. I say sometimes you just have to like kind of chip away. Okay, next time you see them, a week goes by, you say, okay, we talked about this one thing, but also I was just thinking, I read this article about green burial, right? Would that be something that you would be interested in? Or I heard about so-and-so in the neighborhood, or, I always try to, this is where like, leaning on some other things that are happening outside of that person can also be useful strategy, right? To say, I just read about this thing in the newspaper. What do you think about it? I was just curious. I think I might consider it, right? And then you have a mechanism by which you can have another little conversation. So it doesn't have to be a huge, like, let's sit down and then fill out your advance directive. And also, by the way, do your do not resuscitate order. And I want you to prepay for your funeral, right? It doesn't have to look like that. But if grandma wants to do that, or mom or dad want to do that, then, be ready to like work through the, each of those elements with them. If you can. I hope that helps answer the question.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think those were some good takeaways, and with parents myself who are aging and needing to have some conversations with them, I think those are really, really good tips. So I think we're about near the end of our session, our time today. I wanted to thank you again for being with us. This has been so informative. I've learned a lot today from you, and I've really enjoyed this conversation. And we got another comment that I wanted to share. Oh, and I think the person who asked the question followed up saying, those are great tips for me to bring to my clients. So they agreed that was great. And this last comment I wanted to share with you is another thank you message. This person says, I've been watching almost all of the webinars in the past couple of years, and this is most definitely one of the best. And I would agree with that person as well. This has been lovely to chat with you, and thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate everyone's time and attention. And please feel free to reach out if I can answer any questions. I'm happy to do that by email, happy to talk on the phone. So
perfect.
Thank you.
Thanks again. You take care.
Thanks. Bye-bye.